Welcome to my in-depth analysis of Pepsiman for the PlayStation 1. Pepsiman is a promotional game developed by Kid in 1999. It was exclusive to Japan, but they recorded everything in English, so...
Hey, let's start the game!
That's neat. Essentially, you play as Pepsiman, who will be the main focus of this analysis as he runs through various locations and spreads the good word of Pepsi. The game opens with a man purchasing several Pepsi cans at a vending machine, but I don't have too much to say about him at this point, so I'll move on to the first stage. By the way, I'm going to be splitting this analysis into various stages, as I feel like the message of Pepsiman is built up over various sections of the game. The first of these sections is... Stage 1. Pepsiman is a power fantasy. I would argue that the first stage of a game is the most important. Not only is it the first impression of gameplay, but it also establishes the message. From the start of the game, Pepsiman exudes power. I wanted to put this off for as long as possible, but it's occurred to me that it's the very first thing you'll see, so let's talk about Pepsiman's physique. For most of the game, we view Pepsiman from behind, so I'll talk about that first. I can't tell if Pepsiman wears an outfit, or if this is indeed skin, but either way he has very prominent muscles. Pepsiman is, in fact, so obscenely ripped that his muscles clip through his other muscles. His back is split between blue and silver. The reason why is unclear. Anyone familiar with Pepsi the drink knows that the logo is made of 3 colors, white, blue, and red. Yet, here in Pepsi the video game's Pepsi the man's back, red is completely absent. My guess is that the designers realized that silver best highlights the glorious ripples of his
wicked rhomboids.
Moving to the front, you begin to notice that Pepsiman is missing a face, which I think points to the fact that this is a costume and not skin. I'll prove this more definitively later on, but keep it in mind for now. I'm gonna move on from Pepsiman's body now, despite how much fun I'm having, because there's more to talk about. I want to justify my statement that Pepsiman is powerful. What I mean by this isn't just that Pepsiman is physically strong, even though he's absolutely shredded, but that Pepsiman is a very deliberate power fantasy. After all, we aren't just watching Pepsiman, we are the Pepsiman. For anyone unfamiliar, and I'll make this brief because this could get quite long, the term power fantasy refers to the way in which a character appeals to our fantasized view of ourselves, who we wish we could be. A common example of a power fantasy in video games is Kratos from the God of War series. He's ripped, inhumanly strong, possesses seemingly endless stamina, and now he's a hot dad with a sweet beard. A lot of these same points also apply to Pepsiman. Don't laugh, I'm serious. Pepsiman is similarly ripped, he's stronger than the average human, and he's like running for the whole game. His stamina is insane. The only thing Pepsiman is missing is a beard, which I hope they'll add in a reboot somewhere along the line. However, strength alone does not a power fantasy make. For the player to really attach themselves to the character, they have to feel like Pepsiman. Which brings me to my next point. Stage 1, Subsection A, Pepsiman is relatable. My English teacher once told me that relatable is a bad word to use in academia, but this isn't academia. Pepsiman is a relatable character. This point is communicated to the player in a number of ways, but the most prominent is the fact that Pepsiman isn't infallible. In fact, he's kind of a goofball. It's one of the very first things we see. Pepsiman runs headfirst into a wall. It's made abundantly clear that we shouldn't take Pepsiman seriously, which I think is a good move. It must be very attractive to make your soda mascot the coolest dude on earth, especially in the 90s, so having him bump into stuff is surprising. That makes me think that Pepsiman is a very calculated figure. It's clear to me that these decisions were made to bring Pepsiman closer to the audience. This way it's easier for the player to imprint themselves upon Pepsiman's juicy carbonated behind. Pepsiman is also quite unlucky. At the end of every stage, he gets himself into a situation where he has to run away from something, like a giant Pepsi can or a bundle of sticks. We'll get to the bundle of sticks, by the way. I've got beef with the bundle of sticks. But my point is that Pepsiman is not meant to be out of reach. In theory, Pepsiman could be one of us even. You might be thinking, okay, sure, Pepsiman is a flawed character, but how is he my power fantasy? Well, thanks for asking such a relevant question, because that brings me to my next point. Stage 1, Subsection B. You are Pepsiman. In this section, I want to prove that the intention behind Pepsiman was to make you, the player, feel like Pepsiman. I think most of you can probably come to this conclusion on your own. The fact that it's a video game is pretty damning, but I want to be definitive so there's zero doubt. I think the part of the game that most proves this is when Pepsi-Man gets stuck in a rubbish bin. This happens a few times throughout the game, but they're all mostly the same. During these parts, the controls are actually reversed, so the player is forced to experience the same confusion as Pepsi-Man. I think this really proves the connection between Pepsi-Man and the player. The controls are also changed in a few subtle ways during other parts, like with the skateboard and the barrels, but the trash can is the most drastic of these. If you remember that earlier I said that Pepsi-Man is wearing a costume, I'm gonna quickly prove that now. The fact that Pepsi-Man is disoriented by the trash can implies that he can see. He's confused because his vision is blocked. Since his face isn't visible, we can assume that he does actually have eyes underneath, which wouldn't be possible if it were skin. Of course, there's the possibility that Pepsi-Man has some other form of vision, but since the game is largely grounded in reality, I'm not really gonna entertain that theory.
Hi, just a quick editor's note, I was completely wrong about this.
Getting back to my point here, I think the fact that the controls simulate Pepsi-Man's experiences implies that we're meant to put ourselves in his glossy blue super shoes. I kinda touched on this already, but I think I should really nail it down just to be sure, so think of this as a bit of a mini bonus section. Stage 1, bonus section. Pepsi-Man is powerful. So I've already talked about Pepsi-Man's physique. You can see for yourself that he's a bit of a hunk, but I want to prove that this body ain't just for show. I mentioned in passing that Pepsi-Man has very high stamina. He's running for the whole game and only stops at the end of each level. You don't need me to tell you that this would be pretty difficult. Pepsi-Man is also clearly quite strong, although this is a little harder to demonstrate. For one thing, Pepsi-Man often runs directly through walls without losing much, if any, momentum. He's also very durable. He often falls great distances, and he's hit by a truck a couple of times. I don't have the time to figure out the physics of this. You can go ask game theory for that, but I did get a B in stage 1 physics, so I feel like I'm authorized to tell you that you'd probably die if this happened in real life. This section is getting longer than I expected, so let's move on. I hope this is enough to prove that Pepsi-Man is a power fantasy, because it's time for Stage 2. Pepsi-Man is a hero. I think Stage 2 of the game is my personal favourite. After being introduced to Pepsi-Man and his abilities, as well as forming a bond with him in Stage 1, we're thrust into a pretty serious situation. Immediately as the level begins, a police car swerves and crashes in front of Pepsi-Man. Bathed in orange light, Pepsi-Man pushes onward. Is it the sunset? Or is it one of the many pillars of exploding fire throughout the city? We don't know, but we've got a job to do. There are people kneeling in the street. As Pepsi-Man runs past, they hold up signs that read, "Give me Pepsi." At first I thought these people were fools. There is Pepsi laying on the street. I've picked up 3 already, but then I remembered the erratic and chaotic drivers that cursed these sweet Pepsi streets, and it all makes sense. These aren't fools, they are victims, withheld from the refreshing goodness of Coke's slightly younger, slightly better cousin, and they need a hero named Pepsi-Man. So if you're anything like me, you were probably a bit surprised by this level. It's quite a dark concept, and it left me with a lot of questions. The conclusion that I reached here is that the world that Pepsi is trying to portray isn't supposed to be a sunny utopia where everyone loves Pepsi. Instead, the world is a dark place, where bad things happen, not unlike our own. However, there is hope on the horizon. With Pepsi, our lives might just get a little bit brighter. So the idea is that it's a dark dystopia where everyone likes Pepsi, I guess. One of the things that really stood out to me, and I mentioned it before, are the people with signs. There's a bizarre cult-like dependence on Pepsi, which I want to talk about later on, because this is a theme that's present throughout the whole game. For now though, I want to talk about how this scenario sets up Pepsi-Man as a heroic figure. Stage 2, Subsection A, The Hero's Journey, aka the Pepsi Pilgrimage. So my theory is that the stages of Pepsi-Man follow the traditional 3-act structure along with a simplified form of the hero's journey. Pepsi-Man has 4 stages, and my theory is that Stage 1 acts as the setup for the ordinary world. Stage 2 and 3 are Act 2 and involve the ordeal and test of strength for both Pepsi-Man and the player. Stage 4 is obviously the 3rd act and shows the climactic journey back from chaos. I can see why some of you might think this is a stretch, and I think I'll be playing defense here because Pepsi-Man actually skips a lot of the elements of a hero's journey, but I feel like the structure is similar enough that there's a point to be made. I think you'll agree with me when I say that the first stage is very similar to a first act. The world of Pepsi-Man is introduced alongside the protagonist, and it acts as a call to adventure for the rest of the game. The main part of my argument is the second act, stages 2 and 3. I want to argue that these encompass the ordeal and lowest point of Pepsi-Man's journey. Stage 2, Subsection B, The Death of Pepsi-Man. So stage 2 is really where we see Pepsi-Man face the most trouble. The city and construction site are the most perilous areas so far, with lots of obstacles that force the player to stay on their toes. At one point, Pepsi-Man must run through a crowded subway station, taking care not to bump into anybody as he runs. If the player does bump into somebody, they yelp, and then disappear. I'm not sure if this is supposed to signify death. But upon hitting a bystander, Pepsi-Man will stumble and lose momentum. This makes sense in terms of physics, but it also acts as a way to give the player a similar motivation to Pepsi-Man. Pepsi-Man isn't supposed to hit people, and as a player, we don't want to hit people either because we're punished for doing so. Although, this punishment can be avoided by either jumping through the collision or by dashing straight through, so I'm not sure what the message is supposed to be. I've strayed from my point a little bit though. Stages 2 and 3 are Pepsi-Man's ordeal, and showcase the sacrifices he makes to bring hydration to the world. His poetic sacrifice is conveyed most in the moment when Pepsi-Man bestows his sweet cola upon the masses as he falls to his death. From this moment onwards, Pepsi-Man is plunged into a pit of anguish, and he is forced to claw his way out of hell. Stage 2, Subsection C, Hell. Okay, so I was being facetious before. Pepsi-Man doesn't actually go to hell. In fact, he doesn't die at all. Instead, he's chased away by a red pizza truck, which looks familiar. The reason I brought up hell is that, well, Stage 3 sucks ass. It's real bad. Like, the rest of the game is pretty fun, but Stage 3 is a complete nightmare. I'm not gonna pretend like this was intentional, it's just bad game design, but it's surprisingly effective. There's a pretty significant difficulty spike in this stage, which helps to simulate Pepsi-Man's struggle. The lowest point in the hero's journey is also the lowest point in the quality of the game, so we feel like Pepsi-Man. This level also takes place in the desert. If you've never been to a desert before, they're quite dry, so really Pepsi-Man is pretty out of his element here. It's quite likely that a lot of players will die here. The cars and motorcycles demand a lot of pattern memorization, and unless you have really good reflexes, you'll have some trouble. I also want to point out that the desert setting uses a lot of yellow, orange, and brown, which contrast against Pepsi-Man's blue outfit. This really cements him as an outsider here, but he also pops out to the player, which eases the pain of navigating through such a hellish level, by just a little bit. The level ends with the worst part in the whole game. I said I'd come back to the bundle of sticks, which I think is the worst design choice in the whole game. Why do the brown logs have to come out of a bundle of other brown logs? Whose idea was this? They're so hard to see coming, you pretty much just have to memorize it, it's infuriating. But after clearing this section, stage 3 is over, and we can move on to the final stage. This might be a bit of a doozy, so despite the fact that I'm still talking about the hero's journey, I'm going to be separating this into one last stage. Stage 3, Resurrection and Metamorphosis. So there's a recurring theme in Greek mythology which is bled into a lot of modern stories, and this theme is resurrection of the self. Most stories that follow the hero's journey structure have the hero undergo some kind of transformation or resurrection at the climax, and the same is true for Pepsi-Man. Joseph Campbell is well known as the man who identified and popularized the hero's journey. He explains that the hero comes back from his adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. In a sense, what this says is that upon returning from their journey, the hero is a better, more complete person. My argument here is going to be that this return, or resurrection, is not just referring to Pepsi-Man, but to the player as well. Stage 3, Subsection A, half Pepsi, half man. One of the ideas of a hero's growth is a negotiation between the hero and his polar opposite. During the final act, the hero will reconcile with his opposite and learn from it. The result is that the hero and their opposite are eventually one and the same. I'll finally be returning to the man at the very beginning of the game, who buys all the Pepsi cans from the machine. This guy is complicated. I think that a lot of things point to him being a representation of the player. He looks directly at the player and addresses them as a kind of reflection, and he's a lazy, gluttonous bastard, much like your typical gamer. But he's also completely integrated with the Pepsi brand. His fridge is stacked with the stuff. This makes the analog a little bit more complicated, because the game is supposed to convince the player of the virtues of Pepsi, where this guy is completely on board from the beginning. Instead, I think that this guy represents an ideal result, the perfect ambassador for the Pepsi brand, in his own way. This man is half Pepsi, half man. Stage 3, Subsection B. Creating a cola chimera. So we understand now that the expectation for the player is that they're unfit and unhealthy, a polar opposite to the fit and sexy Pepsi Man we play as. These are the polar opposites that will negotiate in the final act. The intention is to create a fusion between us and Pepsi Man. What better place to create such a monstrosity than a factory, which is the setting for Stage 4. Naturally, this setting has the highest amount of Pepsi branding in the game, so at this point we're at maximum product placement. We're essentially running through a series of flashing Pepsi logos. It's also the most intense level of the game, and the only stage that I had to use save states to complete. Hey, you can't expect me to spend that much time on this game, okay? I consider this to be a subliminal trial by fire. It demands that we achieve perfect synchronization with Pepsi Man until we're inseparable. Quote, "The hero, whether god or goddess, man or woman, the figure in a myth or the dreamer of a dream, discovers and assimilates his polar opposite, either by swallowing it or being swallowed. One by one, the resistances are broken. He must put aside his pride, his virtue, beauty, and life, and bow or submit to the absolutely intolerable. Then he finds that he and his opposite are not of differing species, but
one flesh."
Epilogue. What strikes me most about Pepsi Man is the lack of cynicism it has, despite being such an obvious attempt to attach people to the brand. In fact, the game is strangely critical of its own purpose. It's very obvious that the man in the cutscenes isn't supposed to be aspirational. He's a disturbing image of excessive consumption, and this image bleeds into the rest of the game as well. The whole game depicts a world that is disturbingly dependent on Pepsi. You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone drinking something else. People in the street are begging for Pepsi, and victims of a fire, rather than escaping, relish in the enjoyment of their cola. My conclusion then is that Kid Software, in an act of stunning protest, created Pepsi Man as a postmodern work of anti-capitalist art, which I think is pretty cool, man.